Welcome to International Affairs, Episode 7. My name is Jeremy, here with co-host Matt Thomas. And today we're going to do our best to kind of talk about Sudan. It's a timely topic. It's complex.
More questions than answers.
More questions than answers, and we're not really sure what's going on. And I don't think anybody is exactly sure what's going on. But Sudan. Matt, early Sudan, little history or brief little blips in Sudan's history. What do you got?
All right. So as far as a timeline goes, we can really start with around 1967. You have Sudan being the host of the this major Arab League summit, and they sign what was called the Khartoum Resolution, infamous for the three no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiation with it. So all of this is happening around the time of the 6-Day War, and then later wars between Israel and the Arab nations around it. Then it's had coup after coup after coup after coup after coup throughout the 20th century, from the 1950s onward.
Really unstable, a lot of power struggles, fighting factions, really based on ethnic, tribal issues and religion. I think that's what it comes to. You got tons of corruption, and then those competing priorities with so many different factions.
Yeah, and unstable authoritarian regimes, military dictators. You had the Darfur War and genocide in 2013. You had a long-standing civil war, which eventually resulted in the independence of South Sudan. Omar al-Bashir was in charge of the country for nearly 20 years, something like that. And he's ousted in a coup in 2019. During his tenure, it was on the U.S.'s list of state sponsors of terrorism, having harbored al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden.
Yeah, so if we go to the 90s, just, relatively recent history, right? Osama bin Laden was living in Sudan, operating out of Sudan. And Sudan is primarily, or is, a Sunni state. Its long history of being a religious state and kind of that more ultra-conservative Wahhabism, Salafi spin-off, or under the umbrella of the Sunni Islam, really kind of flourishes in Sudan. And so Osama bin Laden found refuge there in the early 90s after leaving the Arab Peninsula, the Saudi Peninsula, and then actually was ousted in, I think, 96.
Yeah, he was expelled in the late 90s, and then found another safe harbor with the Taliban in Afghanistan.
Right.
So,
because in 98 we had, shortly after, kind of that east central part of Africa was really falling under the spell of this super ultra conservative Islam, and we've had a lot of terrorist activity come out of these countries.
Yeah, you have Somalia and Black Hawk Down in the 90s, right?
Right.
You have the embassy bombings in Nairobi and in Tanzania.
Yeah.
So that was a time of a lot of terrorism in East Africa. And then you go into genocide in the Darfur War in 2003. And Omar al-Bashir is kind of central in all of this as the military dictator in the country. He's ousted, like I said, in 2019 by way of a military coup. And then they kind of have this weird transitional government where they're trying to, enact certain reforms and try to get a little bit of aid from the rest of the world.
And kind of power sharing.
And in 2020, in what was largely seen as kind of a quid pro quo, to get removed from the state sponsors of terrorism list. They agree to normalize ties with Israel, but that doesn't last because in 2021 there's another coup, and that's kind of the precursor to what we have here. Out of that coup, you get two military leaders, two generals, one from the army and one from an organization called the RSF. And they start sharing power, but it's kind of devolved into a power struggle.
So it's a coup of a coup, is what's.
What we're seeing here is the coup of the coup of the coup of the coup.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So now we have almost this kind of civil war between the RSF and the army. Is kind of what it looks like right now. That's kind of the best way that I have to describe it.
Yeah, and like we were discussing earlier before we started the show, that the civilian engagement is not that great. Other than they want stability, and they I think they've been pushing for so long to have a civilian government, and to get these really egotistical, power hungry military generals and lieutenant generals out of running government affairs, because it has been decades of instability and
corruption and a whole host of violent affairs, economic problems. It's really been a mess for 20 years and longer. 70 years maybe.
Yeah. And it's sad, the instability, we can probably attribute some of that to the U.S.'s disinterest in.
Yeah, it's kind of taken a backseat in that region to Russia and China, which have really tried to leverage anti-Western sentiment in the entire continent of Africa, really, using that history of colonialism to kind of prop up these dictatorial regimes, often kind of on a Marxist-Leninist ideology, or a radical Islamic mixed with Marxist-Leninist ideologies. And so Russia and China have been really effective at playing the propaganda war, as well as being able to prop up these different corrupt regimes that will help to benefit Russia and China.
Right, and that brings up why, what is the benefit for Russia and China with some of these countries, but in particular Sudan?
Mm-hmm.
Is it natural resources, coastline? What do we got?
So, and I'll speak for the Russian case specifically here in Sudan, that, excuse me, the Russians are really interested in two things. They're interested in a naval base in Sudan. The city of Port Sudan, which is kind of its main port on the Red Sea, is located almost halfway into the Red Sea. And it's an ideal place for the Russians to project naval power and to establish military headquarters in Northeast Africa. And this base gives it quick access to the Indian Ocean, right? The Middle East, Suez Canal, Mediterranean, right? And so it drastically reduces the amount of distance that Russia would have to travel to get to those locations, right, and be able to use its, ability to play that geostrategic game in those regions.
Sure.
And so this places it in a location where it's close to the other places that it's meddling in.
Right.
It's meddling in Libya, Syria. It's a key ally of Iran, right? And it likes to meddle in South Asia, Southwest Asia, Middle East, right?
Yeah, and then we'll talk about the natural resources that are available in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
In several countries there, we've got their private military contractor group, Wagner, operating there. And is it, so is it, we got gold, we got oil, other precious minerals?
Yeah, in Sudan we have gold and oil, and the gold there is is particularly of importance to Russia as it seeks to circumvent sanctions related to the conflict in Ukraine. And so for Russia, it's really interested in being able to maintain close ties with a corrupt authoritarian regime in Sudan. And to a certain degree, it looks like Russia has kind of had amicable relations with both the army and with the RSF.
Sure.
And it appears at this point in time that the Wagner Group is more or less supporting the RSF, which we know that it supported Haftar Khalifa in the Libyan civil war, right? And Khalifa seems to be kind of supporting the RSF as well, but there's no real clear answers as to how or why.
What benefit comes from those particular relationships?
Right. And the RSF leader, popularly known as Hamedi, has been in Moscow recently and seems to be the primary beneficiary of the deal that Russia brokered with Sudan for its naval port at Port Sudan.
Sure, but then we also have oil exports. I believe China gets a decent quantity of crude exported out of Sudan. And so then that brings China into the fold,
right? Of
why Sudan's maybe critical to China energy.
Exactly. And so it would appear, publicly anyway, Russia and China have called for both sides to end the conflict, along with the United States, the EU, and so on. Right? Kind of an unusual thing to see US, UK, EU, China, and Russia all saying stop fighting.
Right.
But at the same time, we know that China and Russia would be wanting the fighting to end for very different reasons than the US, UK, and EU. And yet, we have Russia through the Wagner Group possibly supporting one side. And so where does that go? Right. And how does that fit in? We know...
Well, I suppose if you need those precious minerals and you're circumventing sanctions and you need that payday out of Sudan to help fund whatever actions you have taking place in other parts of the world, if a fight breaks out between your two buddies that are corrupt and allowing you to pilfer those resources, you've, I guess, are pushed to pick a side.
Yeah, and ideologically, Russia's not really bound to either one of them.
Right.
But it appears at this point that Russia is primarily picking the side of the RSF. Perhaps they think that this guy is more likely to succeed, or maybe they think he's more likely to be beholden to them if he does succeed.
Right.
Perhaps he is more likely to allow them to keep doing what they want to do, or maybe there's some kind of deal that gives them more of a regional footprint. We know that they're involved in Libya and in the Central African Republic and here in Sudan. So there's a lot of questions, but we don't really have any clear answers yet as to how all of this fits together. Right, now that military base on the primarily naval base at Port Sudan, what Sudan got out of it is that so Russia would be able to have four naval ships, nuclear capable ships, in the Red Sea, and then would also be able to station certain amounts of its military assets beyond the naval personnel in Port Sudan. In exchange, Sudan got 25 years of basically weapons delivery from Russia, which would then be renewed every in 10-year increments as long as both sides agreed. And so that's what Sudan got out of this, was basically a a string of military supplies.
And I presume the U.S. pushed back against that before that deal went down, and Sudan, those two boys running the country, said, no, we want weapons, we want money, we want to give them our gold and oil.
And
the deal
basically they said out loud that they didn't care if it was Russia. They wanted the weapons and the money.
Right.
So you have that going on there. And besides, Russia is kind of an ideal partner for a corrupt authoritarian regime because Russia's not going to ask it to change.
Right. Yeah.
In any way other than to benefit Russia itself. And those kinds of changes are the kinds of changes that a corrupt dictatorial regime would like. So it's not going to ask it to improve on its human rights record like the United States would.
Right.
So this is kind of, to a certain degree, that involvement there. We know that Russia wants to leverage its regional power over in that particular area of the world, and to be able to, since the Soviet times,
they've been playing around in Africa for a long time.
Playing around in Africa, seeking to prop up friendly regimes in Africa, to extract resources, to have kind of a large political front against the West.
Right.
You have in that meddling in Africa, and you also have that meddling in the Middle East, where they basically tried to support or prop up anything that would be antithetical to U.S. or UK, French, interests in the Middle East. And so that's why you have them supporting the revolution in Iran. That's why you have them tacitly supporting Hezbollah and so forth throughout the Soviet period, and then later on into post-Soviet Russia. These different groups that, Russia backs Islamic State sponsors of terror, as well as various terror organizations within the Middle East, while at the same time squashing them at home. Right. Because they are useful to it in its objectives against the West.
Yeah, really interesting. So it's in Sudan now, there was an attempted ceasefire brokered because there's a lot of foreigners in Sudan. This thing kind of popped off overnight, and it's how do we get all these people out? And so that's a current work in progress on how do we exfil all of these innocent foreign citizens. Each country has their own responsibility to do that. Protect embassies, close down embassies, draw down staff, get people out of the country. And so the intel must be pointing to a further deterioration and somewhat of a collapse. And then who's holding the bag and what's going to happen next? Right.
And so if we're going to end up with some kind of a collapse, who wins the power struggle, or is there a power vacuum? And from there, who fills that vacuum in? Right. We don't know.
Right. But we do know, though, that we're going to have these strong players, Russia, China, and collectively the West, that are attempting to
shape the outcome
and provide some stability, whether that's through short-term, more aggressive action on one side to completely stomp out the other side, or peace talks, negotiations, which, I don't think that doesn't work anymore.
Right.
In this context.
In this particular context, what do we have to give them? Right. What leverage is there?
Right.
How do you get these sides that are so vehemently against you,
and equally as corrupt,
equally as ideologically driven, equally as authoritarian?
Right. They want nothing other than what they want.
Exactly.
Selfishly want.
Yeah, and to enrich themselves. right? So, where do you go from there? And it's going to take a lot of creativity to be able to work with that. And unfortunately for us, they're more likely to be willing to work with the Russians and the Chinese because the Russians and Chinese are going to more or less give them what they want. And in exchange, they're going to give the Russians and Chinese what they want, and you'll have this relationship that, it might be a parasitic one for Sudan in the case that it's being sucked dry of anything that it could have, but the authoritarian dictator doesn't care because he's getting what he wants.
Right. If that equals money, it doesn't matter.
Exactly.
If the country's getting sucked dry. That's so. As you alluded to, way more questions than answers. And the questions are important. If we can't develop proper questions or even the thought process to come up with the right questions, then we'll never get to a potential answer if we don't ask them.
And right now, the information is very muddy, and you have charges being levied against one another, and they're accusing each other of doing the things that they're accusing each other of doing, right? So one guy says, you're doing this, and the other guy says, no, you're doing this, and it's back and forth and back and forth.
Right, and they're probably both doing it.
And exactly, they're probably both doing it. Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin denies being involved in this, and yet more or less when he says that any questions related to their involvement in it is essentially a provocation. I mean, there's a threat, right? He's involved,
right?
and so that answers that question. And besides, we have intelligence that indicates that yes, they are involved, and that is more or less open source, right?
I don't know. You weren't supposed to say that, Matt.
Right? We have you can read a news article and find where the planes are going, and so. What intelligence we have beyond that, I don't really know, but that much is open source, and so we know that Wagner Group is involved, and why wouldn't they be, right? There's key interests in Sudan with the natural resources and with maintaining a regime in Sudan that will be co-opted by the Russians, and you have Somalia right next door, not far away. You have Central African Republic right there. You have Libya right there. So geographically, it makes sense.
Right. And then what kind of additional spillover are we going to have out of Sudan, right? Whenever we had the Arab Spring, there was a lot of spillover, as the Sudanese coups have taken place over decades, right? Information flow is much quicker, faster, even than it was maybe in 2019. And so as information propagates and, you've got both sides essentially conducting psychological operation campaigns against the other side, a lot of propaganda, a lot of information flow, where's the truth lie? And that's all getting pushed out to the base citizenry of Sudan. As this thing really starts to take shape and spin out of control, it's going to be interesting to watch and see what happens.
And how that affects stability in places that have already been unstable in the past, such as South Sudan, Central African Republic, and so on.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Somalia as well.
And then we have the outflow of refugees. A bunch of people are leaving. I see that a lot are heading towards Nairobi, and it just what is that going to do? What's the Kenyan government going to say? As they start to get bombarded with refugees from another Sudanese conflict, and then there's that spillover of extreme Islamic idea that starts to flood into some of these countries that have been more moderate or have gained some more moderacy over time. That influence. It'll be interesting to watch and see what happens. I love Africa. I wish I was there to see for myself what was going on. But Sudan, if you guys have any idea on what's going on in Sudan, leave us some comments. Let's have a dialogue back and forth. Let's talk day to day Let's talk strategically. Let's talk tactically. Let's not play around with Sudan. That sounds bad. Let's figure out Sudan.
Throw some ideas out there and ask the questions and say, okay, what is happening? Why is it happening? How does it affect the region? How does it affect broader geopolitics? How did we get here? And where do we go from here?
Right. Yeah. And what's the root cause of continual failure in Sudan? Same thing with Somalia. What's the root cause of continual failure? Who are these people that get put into positions of power?
And what makes them tick?
Right.
What makes them do the things that they do? And, is it ideology? Is it greed? Is it lust for power? Is it any number of different things? I think to a certain degree in Sudan, you probably have all three of those and more.
And so, do super authoritarian dictators create stability?
Clearly they don't, right?
Or in some cases, will it? I guess to what extent would Sudan need like hardcore authoritarian rule? Could that create some stability for 20, 30 years?
Right. We had continuous hardcore authoritarian rule under Omar al-Bashir, and yet there we had civil war ongoing, Darfur genocide, and harboring Al-Qaeda.
Right.
So perhaps these people also maybe foment more instability. But if you get one on the other end of the spectrum that has it completely locked down, like say Berdi Muhammadov in Turkmenistan, well, Turkmenistan is a dreadful place to live, but it is stable. Right. So, I mean,
that's kind of what I'm alluding to. On what end of the continuum do we say, all right, what the Sudanese have been doing has not worked. Why has it not worked? And what are the potential alternatives?
And what would a democratic transition look like in Sudan? Would it be another Egypt debacle, where you have the basically the democratically elected scumbag was just as bad or worse than the authoritarian scumbag, and was even more harsh on human rights, persecuted the Coptic Christians even more terribly than had been done under the authoritarian dictators, and supported more terroristic elements in society? Or do you get something that could actually be a positive development in Sudan? Where on that continuum does it lie? And what potential does it have to reach either outcome, good or bad? Right?
Yeah. So I guess, what do you see, in your opinion, of further U.S. involvement and interest in Sudan? Is that something that we
can and should pursue? Or?
I mean, right now, if I'm looking at the agenda, right, we've got China, Taiwan, we've got Russia, Ukraine, and other issues.
Yeah, where does this one lie on the list of priorities? And really, what can we reasonably achieve?
Right.
And your guess is as good as mine. As far as that goes, because of how much sway Russia and China really do have in Sudan, that it's hard to say.
It is a complete quagmire, and it's been this way for a long time, unfortunately. And it's sad because there are extreme human rights abuses that are taking place, and a lot of innocent people being displaced, losing their lives. Horrible suffering. And so that is something that I can't tolerate. However, it's what do you do?
How do you fix it, and can you fix it? And if you can, what does that look like?
Right.
You know?
Right. Yeah. And, unfortunately that, gets added to the list of problems in the world, and
which seem to be growing day by day.
We can just continue to add that, pencil those in and say, what can the U.S. do? What can the U.S. with our allies do? Because we can't do everything, unfortunately. And it's sad. It's sad. We need to be strong. We need to build up strength. We need to project power. We need strong leadership, because these things matter. And
from here, what happens next? Right? Where does it go? Where does the next fire start? Where's the next fire start? And how does this affect our interests in the rest of the world? And how does this affect human lives in Sudan itself, and then broadly elsewhere, right? Depending on what does happen next. Does this spill over into a broader conflict? Does it stay contained within Sudan? We don't know at this time, right?
Right. We need some. We need to send some spies over there and figure out what's going on. Get some good intel, and find out, what do these guys want? What's going to satisfy them?
And who will they be in 10, 20 years whenever they've taken power and become the next Omar al-Bashir?
Right. Yeah. So really, back again, circling around, questions are more important than answers. We don't have the answers, but we know, as we're watching with you guys day by day what's happening in Sudan, keeping track of the news, trying to follow the developments as they take place. It's not easy. It's complex. This is international affairs. This is, geopolitics. This is, we're going to even, part of what we do around the globe is deny this extreme Islamic ideology a foothold, because when they're able to have a safe place to operate out of, those groups start to grow. And those groups start to develop. And, so it's going to be interesting to see if we, where Sudan lies in the future with
these
radicalism.
Groups, and these groups have ideological affinities with other radical ways of thinking, right? Most of these kind of more or less fascist in their Islamism groups, beyond just violent terrorist extremism, also economically fall into a Marxist-Leninist camp. Their propaganda is inherently Marxist-Leninist in its nature. They have mutual affinities with Russia, with China, and you saw this in the mid 20th century as well, with Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt and his Pan-Arabism, right? You had that same connection with Marxism and Leninism out of this kind of solidifying of an anti-Western, anti-US bloc of essentially a block of evil.
Right. Yeah. So where does Sudan go from here? We don't know. We need smart people to figure that out. And, we should be praying for the situation in Sudan and praying for our country. And we'll try to update or have more discussion about Sudan as things develop, because it's on the list, and it's going to, unfortunately, be a long conflict. This is not something that's just going
to end overnight.
To end overnight. So that's Sudan in a nutshell from Matt and I's point of view. We're not experts on Sudan, but we know a little bit about international affairs and how all this stuff might work together. So that's episode 7, Sudan. Matt, you got anything else to add before we go?
Right. Sometimes this is the name of the game, right? You have a really sticky situation with no good answers. It's like, how do you get chewing gum out of your hair? Right.
Right. Oil, peanut butter.
Right. And so you have a quagmire, and more or less one of the unfortunate things in all of this is that sometimes different countries don't play nice.
Right.
And
somebody's got to take a lead in this thing.
Mm-hmm. And oftentimes we end up seeing a scenario where there is loss of human life, lots of quite a bit of human suffering in the process, and it just keeps going and it keeps building. Sudan appears to be one of these cases at this point in time, and at this juncture, I don't really see a positive resolution to the problem, but hopefully we can have people who are creative and are able to work with the situation. So, like you said, Sudan's a quagmire, and it's not the only one of these in the world, but it is one that has really started to boil over over the last few days, and like you said, we'll keep tracking that and finding new developments as we continue to look at the timely issues around the world.
Absolutely. And hey, we gave away a book a few weeks ago. We never heard from you. I think it was The Grumpy Pair, The Angry Pair, something like that. If that's you, reach out to us. And if we don't hear from you, we'll try to figure out how to send you a message through YouTube. It's all new to us, but we'll try to figure out how to get in contact with you so that we can mail you a signed copy of Jim Olson's book, The Art of Counterintelligence to Catch a Spy. Former CIA chief of counterintelligence. Great guy. Great book. So The Grumpy Pair, was it Angry Pair? Grumpy?
I think it was Grumpy. The Grumpy Pair.
Hey,
and
reach out to us.
And next week we will be choosing the next winner.
Yeah, so I think we're going to have 4 or 5 signed copies of Jim Olson's book. We really like to give them away. And we cannot see most of our subscribers because you guys have your settings set to private. So we don't know who you are. We only have like 20 people in our list, I think.
That we can actually see who they are.
Right, out of nearly 100 subscribers. So if you want to win a copy, you got to come out of the closet.
Mm-hmm. Right, come out of the cold.
right. All right, so, guys. Thanks for listening. That's episode 7, Sudan, with INTA Now, International Affairs. We'll see you guys for the next episode. Have a great night.